Good morning, everyone. What a way to start a new week. Yet another scandal that goes to the heart of what is America.
First, as the IRS scandal targeting conservatives continues to unravel.
Does this sound like a familiar story?
That was the scene at the Capitol on Friday as the House kicked off its hearings into the IRS. Senate Finance Committee holds its hearings this
IRS
week.
Scandal targeting conservatives continues to unravel. The pressing question remains, what political implications will all this have?
Twin political storms gathered more force today over potential misdeeds at the IRS.
Tomorrow morning, I'll introduce a resolution that says, why don't we fire the IRS agents that abuse their power?
What we do know is that politics was put ahead of the public interest.
The committee will come to order if everyone can take their seats.
In response to a question at an American Bar Association convention, a second-level IRS person said, oh, yeah, by the way, we did target these people.
Strongly disagree with the Tea Party on many issues, defend it from any impairment, and allow it to be as wrong as it wants to be.
And there was no political motive whatever involved. Now, the question is, how stupid do they think we are?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Lois Lerner, and I'm the Director of Exempt Organizations at the Internal Revenue Service. I have been a government employee for over 34 years. I initially practiced law at the Department of Justice and later at the Federal Election Commission. I have not done anything wrong. I have not broken any laws. I have not violated any IRS rules or regulations, and I have not provided false information to this or any other congressional committee. And while I would very much like to answer the committee's questions today, I've been advised by my counsel to assert my constitutional right not to testify or answer questions related to the subject matter of this hearing. After very careful consideration, I've decided to follow my counsel's advice and not testify or answer any of the questions today. Because I'm asserting my right not to testify, I know that some people will assume that I've done something wrong. I have not. One of the basic functions of the Fifth Amendment is to protect innocent individuals, and that is the protection I'm invoking today. Thank you.
As director of the IRS division overseeing matters of tax exemption, Lois Lerner, by her own admission, targeted applications by Tea Party groups and other conservative organizations for special scrutiny during the months leading up to the 2012 election. Responding to a planted question at a conference of the American Bar Association, Lerner admitted something that had been known to conservative activists in Ohio for years. They had been specifically targeted for illegal harassment by the IRS. According to Lerner, the IRS office in Cincinnati used names like Tea Party or Patriots, and they selected cases simply because the applications had those names in the title. She also acknowledged that this was absolutely incorrect, insensitive, and inappropriate.
We know deep down in our hearts, okay, it's not hard. It really isn't. Go out, take care of business, get a job, get an education, gain some experience, and be successful. It is the American formula for success. It has worked for 200 years, and it still works today. When politicians sacrifice sacred principles for political purposes, it is not only our right, but it is our duty to hold them accountable. Now is the time to unite.
Ohio was a key state in the Obama administration's re-election campaign, and the administration had an obvious interest in suppressing the Tea Party movement in that state.
I do solemnly swear
I am a federal employee
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
I never once thought about working for the federal government, but they came to my college and I talked to them and it sounded interesting, and I applied and I was lucky and was hired, and then it was clear to me, once I was hired, it was clear to me that this was really important work, and it was work that I thought I would be good at, and it was important work for the country.
According to the White House Visitors Log, on March 31st, 2010, President Obama had a meeting with Colleen Kelly, president of the National Treasury Employees Union, or NTEU. That union, which represents IRS employees, had already taken a public stand in opposition to the Tea Party movement. On the day after that meeting, American Spectator correspondent Jeffrey Lord notes that IRS employees set to work in targeting the Tea Party and conservative groups around America, a fact documented in the Inspector General's report.
Well, there needs to be a comprehensive and full investigation. It's pretty clear to me, based on events of recent days, that the administration has been lying about what it knew and when. And they're mischaracterizing the nature of the activity by the IRS as a bureaucratic snafu. This was a coordinated effort, in my view. There was a systematic concern expressed by the left and Obama and his allies about the activities of the Tea Party and conservative groups. And the IRS, in effect, put all these groups in a box by delaying their exemptions, by auditing others, and even auditing individuals personally. And not because they were doing anything wrong, but because of their political views and their philosophical outlook toward the role of government.
You know, at some point, it just becomes more about hating him than loving your country,
No,
does it
they
not?
hate America. That's really what it is.
They hate America?
Yeah, I think these conservatives and right-wingers really, for as much as they say they love this country, they hate it. They hate the government. They hate people.
But those are two different things, aren't they?
No, well, it shouldn't be. The government's supposed to be of, by, and for the people, right?
Whether or not an explicit command was given by Obama to harass the Tea Party, it's clear that he wanted the IRS to target his political enemies, and that the agency was full of partisan Democrats eager to do so. The Washington Examiner reports that Democratic candidates received at least 75% of the documented campaign contributions made by IRS employees at the Cincinnati office. This office was involved in the agency's illegal targeting of Tea Party groups and other conservative activists. One IRS employee, interviewed by reporter Tim Carney, belongs to a Facebook group called Target the Shutdown at the Tea Parties, which was created during the debt ceiling debate in 2011. The creators of this Facebook page supported a strategy in which shutdowns in government services would be targeted at so-called Tea Party states. For example, the group suggested the administration could shut down air traffic control at airports in Norfolk, Tampa, Nashville, Indianapolis, Salt Lake City, and other towns with a large Tea Party presence.
I want to start with a story of an attack on something so American, you can always put it in the same category as baseball and apple pie. I'm talking about rock and roll, and more specifically, one of the most well-known instruments that has helped create and keep rock and roll alive.
The Obama administration has made no effort to hide the fact that it was willing to use regulatory agencies to retaliate against its political opponents.
Last week, the Gibson guitar factories in Memphis and Nashville, Tennessee were raided.
Armed federal agents seized a huge amount of the company's inventory as part of an investigation into claims that the company had violated an obscure law called the Lacey Act by improperly importing exotic woods from overseas. No criminal charges were filed against Gibson, but the company was eventually forced to pay a $300,000 penalty to the Justice Department, in addition to a $50,000 community service payment to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. But the total cost to the company in lost inventory and legal expenses was estimated to be more than $5 million.
As it happens, one of the Gibson Company's chief competitors, the C.F. Martin Guitar Company, boasts in its catalogs and promotional literature that it manufactures high-quality instruments using exactly the same exotic woods, yet the Martin Company has been left alone by the feds. What accounts for this disparate treatment? It may be significant that Gibson CEO Henry Juskowitz is a significant Republican donor.
Hi, I'm Chris Martin.
And that Martin CEO Chris Martin IV is a longtime Democratic Party donor.
Well, a number of media outlets are now asking whether Congress needs to take a new look at a federal raid on Gibson Guitar.
These guys and women came dressed in SWAT gear. They then seized what they said was the illegal wood. They effectively shut down the business, a beloved business to many Americans, but a privately held, perfectly lawful business. They shut it down for about a month. But who decided that instead of knocking on the door saying you're using the wrong wood and we're going to fine you, and if you don't like the fine, you can challenge us?
It's a phone call.
And,
it's a phone call.
And instead sent what looked like an army to invade this place.
Because now the reports are that Gibson, okay, so their chief executive is a big Republican contributor.
Right.
But at the same time, this company, C.F. Martin and Company, was using the same East Indian rosewood. And
to make their guitars.
Their CEO was a big, long time, is Democratic supporter. With the tens of thousands of contributions to Democratic candidates, he did not get raided.
Look, the raid was unjustifiable. The use of force at the raid was criminal.
To an extent unprecedented in our nation's history, the Obama administration has behaved like a third world regime, employing unaccountable executive branch regulatory agencies to harass and punish the president's political critics. In that bureaucratic arsenal, there is no more fearsome weapon than the IRS, and Lois Lerner has a long history of harassing conservative organizations.
In the 1990s, Lerner served as chief of enforcement at the Federal Elections Commission. Under her direction, the FEC undertook the largest enforcement action in its history, suing the Christian Coalition for violating campaign laws. The Christian Coalition won.
Before being appointed to head the IRS's Exempt Organizations Division in 2001, Lerner was head of the Enforcement Office at the Federal Election Commission. During the late 1990s, Lerner carried out an aggressive investigation of conservative groups who had opposed Bill Clinton and his policies, focusing particularly on the Christian Coalition.
James Bopp was the Christian Coalition's lawyer.
Well, I was shocked and appalled.
James Bopp Jr., who at the time was lead counsel for the Christian Coalition, recalls that Lerner subpoenaed 81 depositions from 48 different employees of the organization. She also filed 127 document requests, 32 interrogatories, and 1,813 requests for admission, that is, demands that the group incriminate itself as violating campaign laws. She demanded that the group surrender tens of thousands of pages of documents, many of them dealing with sensitive and confidential information about finances and donors. Similar treatment was given to each of the coalition's 49 state affiliates. Under Lois Lerner's direction, the FEC interrogated activists associated with the Christian Coalition about their religious activities. Her investigators demanded to know the names of people who attended prayer meetings and the nature and content of prayers offered at those meetings. 3 pastors from South Carolina, who had only a distant relationship to the Christian Coalition, were forced to give depositions regarding their personal religious views, their personal political activism, and the activities of their congregations.
When Bopp learned years later that Lerner had been promoted to an IRS position, he became concerned.
She was being, in effect, promoted for what she had done at the Federal Election Commission, and now was going to be expected, in what I was concerned about, expected to replicate that at the IRS, and now we know that's exactly what happened.
Familiar chance. They laid claim to the sidewalks in front of the Federal. Borrowing a page from Occupy, they laid claim to the sidewalks in front of the Federal building.
Lerner's behavior at the FEC foreshadowed the tactics that were later employed by her IRS subordinates in targeting the Tea Party and pro-life activists in Ohio and elsewhere during the 2012 campaign. Some pro-life leaders, for instance, were told by IRS officials that they would have to describe the content of prayers offered at their meetings. Many other conservative groups were required to fill out long, detailed questionnaires regarding members, donors, personal associations, and activities unrelated to any legitimate questions about their tax-exempt status. While Lerner and her underlings subjected conservative groups to invasive and, as she later admitted, improper scrutiny, spared partisan Democratic groups similar treatment. In fact, Lerner very quickly approved a tax exemption request filed on behalf of a group called the Barack H. Obama Foundation, a supposed charity run by the president's Kenyan half-brother, Malik Obama. That foundation operated illegally for 5 years before being shut down.
Malik Obama is going into politics. On March 4th, he wants to run for the governor's seat in Siaya. The county near Victoria Lake includes Kogelo.
Malik Obama, whose full name is Abango Roy Malik Obama, is a reputed conman who's been accused of beating one of his 12 wives and seducing his most recent wife while she was a 17-year-old schoolgirl. The foundation he named after his famous brother was purportedly based in Arlington, Virginia, but it was never registered in that state. Malik Obama solicited funds for that foundation for 3 years before it received tax-exempt status, which is a violation of federal law. Nonetheless, Lerner approved the group's exemption request in 2011 within a month of receiving it.
I have not done anything wrong. I have not broken any laws. I have not violated any IRS rules or regulations, and I have not provided false information to this or any other congressional committee. And while I would very much like to answer the committee's questions today, I've been advised by my counsel to assert my constitutional right not to testify or answer questions related to the subject matter of this hearing. After very careful consideration, I have decided to follow my counsel's advice and not testify or answer any of the questions today.
Although Lois Lerner insists that the Fifth Amendment protects her from accountability for her official conduct, she's made a career out of targeting conservative activists and demanding that they incriminate themselves. Lerner has also displayed a vindictive streak in dealing with people who have been subjected to her scrutiny and emerged unscathed. This was on display during her time with the FEC.
No, she said it. I asked her to put it in writing, but she said they don't do that, which made me
In 1996, when Lerner was in charge of the Federal Election Commission's Enforcement Office, she conducted an investigation of conservative activist Al Salvi, who ran as the Republican challenger to Illinois Democratic Senator Dick Durbin. The Illinois Democratic Party, following the Chicago-style political handbook that has been so useful to the Obama administration, filed several spurious FEC complaints against Salvi alleging violations of campaign finance regulations. Lerner approached Salvi and offered him a deal she thought he wouldn't be able to refuse. According to Salvi, Lerner told him, "Promise me you will never run for office again and we'll drop the case." Unlike Lerner's behavior in her recent campaign appearance, Salvi points out he didn't plead the Fifth, and in 2000 a federal judge dismissed the FEC case against him. Salvi recalls that Lerner was shocked by the decision, exclaiming, "We never lose," and then turning to him and saying, "We'll get you." A few weeks later, Salvi received a visit from FBI agents claiming to investigate a campaign contribution made by his elderly mother. In 2001, a year after her war against Salvi ended with an ignominious courtroom debate, Lerner was appointed to the IRS, where she would be instrumental in the Obama administration's persecution of conservative activists.
These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise-wide. Its never-ending mission is to seek out new tax forms, explore strange new regulations, to boldly go where no government employee has gone before. Captain, according to their leaders, the planet's civilization has degraded to anarchy. Chaos rules over order. We've sent a landing party to assess the situation and report back. We hope we're not too late.
In addition to being compulsively abusive, the IRS is also immensely wasteful and notoriously incompetent. After all, they're not only spending other people's money, they're the people who shake down the victims in the first place. So why should they be careful about how they spend that money?
The no-taxion's lack of skilled tax leaders has resulted in a widespread case of confusion.
When he's not in costume playing the beloved Star Trek character, Mr. Spock, Ferris Fink is the head of the IRS's Small Business and Self-Employed Division. He presided over the creation of a poorly produced Star Trek parody used as a training video at a lavish IRS employee conference held in Anaheim, California in 2010. The total cost of those videos, which boasted performances and production values inferior to homemade YouTube offerings that are made for free, was more than $50,000.
Mr. Chairman, those videos were, at that time they were made, were an attempt to, in a well-intentioned way, use humor, the Star Trek video, to open the conference.
Ill-conceived and ineptly produced Star Trek parodies were the least of the offenses involved in the 2010 IRS conference in Anaheim. The event cost taxpayers at least $4.1 million, much of it devoted to lavish accommodations, expensive perks, and wildly overpriced motivational speakers, such as one presenter who was paid $17,000 to give a lecture about leadership through painting. The public will most likely never receive any detailed accounting of how that $4.1 million was spent. This is because IRS officials didn't keep receipts in order to tabulate their business expenses. According to the Inspector General's report, IRS management could not provide any documentation detailing how this money was spent. This is because the agency in charge of conducting audits of taxpayers was not required to keep track of and report the costs of employee conferences. A taxpayer who fails to keep receipts of business expenses may face tax audits, fines, or criminal penalties. A financial officer employed by a private company who can't account for millions of dollars in business expenses can expect to be fired, sued, and perhaps prosecuted for embezzlement. But officials with the world's largest tax collection agency aren't required to live up to those standards.
Two unnamed employees of the Internal Revenue Service involved in a hugely expensive 2010 conference in Anaheim face much lighter consequences. Despite the fact that the conference cost taxpayers $4.1 million, most of which cannot be adequately accounted for, the anonymous IRS officials have been placed on administrative leave, which is the equivalent of a paid vacation.
Even more outrageous is the fact that the Anaheim event was not an isolated incident. In the middle of the most severe economic downturn since the Great Depression, the IRS spent more than $50 million on employee conferences. In late 2008, a group of Massachusetts congressmen managed to set aside $92 million out of the money allocated for the Wall Street bailout to renovate the Andover, Massachusetts IRS Service Center, which was scheduled for closure no later than 2009. That IRS office was devoted to processing paper returns, which made it obsolete in an era when most tax returns are filed electronically. Democratic Representative Nikki Tsongas of Massachusetts urged that money be set aside to renovate the obsolete Andover IRS office. According to Representative Tsongas, the creation and preservation of jobs within the federal government are paramount toward rebuilding and strengthening America's economy. At a time when businesses across the country were streamlining their operations, cutting costs, and laying off employees, the obsolete IRS office in Andover received its taxpayer-funded makeover, and no expense has been spared. The new building, which was christened the Tax Mahal by understandably resentful local taxpayers, is to have a reflecting pool, an art gallery, indoor gardens, a 7,000 square foot cafeteria, and an amphitheater. The objective, explains architect Jonathan Levy, is to turn the IRS facility into a comfortable, collaborative environment. It will be welcoming for the people who use it. Those comforts, of course, are for the benefit of the money-grabbing government employees who will staff the office, rather than any tax-paying victims who might pay an occasional visit. It's much more likely that visitors from the productive sector, already intimidated at the prospect of an interview with the IRS, would be resentful as they took in the needless opulence in which their tormentors operate, particularly if he understands that he helped pay for it. During the same period when the IRS was targeting conservative groups, former IRS Commissioner Douglas Shulman actually took the time to offer public support to a known tax cheat, Democratic Congressman Charles Rangel of New York.
I don't want anyone to feel embarrassed, awkward. Hey, if I was you, I may want me to go away too. I am not going away.
In 2008, it was learned that Congressman Rangel had refused to pay taxes on $75,000 in rental income from properties he owned in the Caribbean. After this was discovered, Rangel's first impulse was to blame his wife, Alma, who managed the family's finances. When that didn't work, he tried to assign at least some of the blame to the Spanish-speaking tenants of the property, complaining, "Every time I thought I was getting somewhere, they'd start speaking Spanish." It was later discovered that Rangel, who was a longtime congressman, was exceptionally wealthy, was actually evading tax payments in order to qualify for hardship case rent controls on properties he maintains in New York City and the special homestead tax exemption he was claiming on his property in Washington, D.C. Rangel's case earned the personal attention of IRS Commissioner Shulman, who in 2009 traveled to the congressman's district in Harlem, New York, to deal with the matter personally. Oddly enough, the commissioner didn't bring a set of handcuffs. Instead, he came to make a personal appearance with Representative Rangel at a town hall meeting. Shulman described Rangel, whose multiple violations of the tax code and deliberate fraud would be enough to land most people in prison, as one of the leaders in this country on tax policy issues, and said that he was honored to be on stage with him.
What the president proposed is that working with the bill that passed the House, which included a provision that I think Mr. Kanjorski authored, to give the government the ability to limit risk-taking by banks.
Congressman Rangel was not the only federal official who retained his high position despite tax delinquencies that would trigger severe IRS enforcement actions, if committed by common citizens. When Timothy Geithner was nominated to be Secretary of the Treasury, it was learned that he had refused to pay Medicare and Social Security taxes for several years, despite the fact that his employer, the International Monetary Fund, would have fully reimbursed him. A 2006 audit of Mr. Geithner's taxes discovered other irregularities, including dubious dependent child deductions. These irregularities would be sufficient to provoke punitive action by the IRS if once again they turned up in the tax history of an ordinary taxpayer. Geithner, as it turned out, had nothing to worry about. He was quickly confirmed by the Senate to be Treasury Secretary, a position that requires, among other things, competence in accounting and an understanding of the tax code. Pak Chung Mar, a 76-year-old Queens resident, shocked a crowd gathered at Rockefeller Center to watch a taping of the Today Show when he grabbed 2 knives and slashed his wrists. The agitated man told the crowd that the IRS ruined my life, leaving him all but penniless and unable to pay his rent. Mr. Mar, who has a history of psychological problems, may or may not have been a victim of the IRS, but countless people have seen their lives and livelihoods ruined by the tax collection agency. In February 2010, 53-year-old Joseph Stack flew a small plane into an IRS building in Austin, Texas, killing himself after setting fire to his own home. In a farewell letter, Stack explained that the IRS had wrecked his business and ruined his life through a small and arbitrary change in the tax code. Wrote Stack, "How can any rational individual explain that white elephant conundrum in the middle of our tax system? Here we have a system that is by far too complicated for the brightest of the master scholars to understand, yet it mercilessly holds accountable its victims, claiming that they're responsible for fully complying with laws not even the experts understand. The law requires a signature on the bottom of a tax filing, yet no one can say truthfully that they understand what they are signing. If that's not duress, then what is? If this is not the measure of a totalitarian regime, nothing is." For many years, Stack patiently worked within the system, watching his businesses decline and seeing his wealth evaporate. After being taught and earnestly believing in the rule of law and observing the criminal conduct of the government that demanded his loyalty, Stack came to conclude that violence is the only answer. As social commentator Gerald Celente observes, when people lose everything and have nothing left to lose, they lose it. So on February 18th, 2010, Stack set fire to his home, fueled up his Piper Cherokee PA-28, and set course for the IRS office in Austin. I saw it written once that the definition of insanity is repeating the same process over and over and expecting the outcome to be different. Stack's note concluded, "I'm finally ready to stop this insanity. Well, Mr. Big Brother IRS man, let's try something different. Take my pound of flesh and sleep well." Following Stack's despairing gesture of defiance toward the agency that had persecuted him and ruined his business, Hadi Bayrak of the so-called Southern Poverty Law Center, which works as a private intelligence agency on behalf of the feds, condemned his action as a form of domestic terrorism. According to Bayrak, this morning's attack by Joseph Andrew Stack against an IRS building in Austin, Texas, is a reminder again of how extreme hatred of government can morph into violence. Neither she nor anyone else at the SPLC bothered to prescribe the proper attitude toward a government that can ruin a man's career and financial prospects through a small change in the vast and all but inscrutable tax code. Nor has the SPLC or other self-anointed arbiters of acceptable political attitudes displayed concern over the hatred towards tax victims that can be found spewing from the IRS, or the violence that frequently results from it.
Mr. Patno.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the Senate Finance Committee. My name is David Patno. I am currently an enrolled agent in Camarillo, California, representing taxpayers before the collection divisions of the Internal Revenue Service for over 7 years. Prior to this, I was a revenue officer for the Internal Revenue Service for over 10 years. During my tenure with the IRS, I was a revenue officer, an on-the-job instructor for trainee revenue officers, an instructor for revenue officer training schools, Phase 1 and Phase 2 sessions, and an offer and compromise specialist and an advisor in the special procedures function. I have worked in the Anchorage, Alaska, Shreveport, Louisiana, and Brooklyn, New York IRS offices, which provided me with a great opportunity to see how collection worked in different areas of the country. Now working as a taxpayer's advocate, I have had the opportunity to see things from the other side. It is from this wide range of experience that I speak to you today. Despite what I believe to be a rather unique background, I have found dealing with the IRS personnel to be quite disturbing in a few cases and downright maddening in others.
In testimony before Congress, former IRS District Chief David Patno effectively described the agency as a terrorist group, that is, an organization that uses the threat of lethal violence to terrorize people into surrendering their legitimately earned private wealth. According to Patno, more tax is collected by fear and intimidation than by the law. People are afraid of the IRS. In recent years, the IRS has adopted the pose that they are providing services to taxpayers, whom they refer to as customers. But the supposed service they render is the seizure of wealth from their purported customers, who are more accurately described as victims. Calling a taxpayer a customer of the IRS is a bit like referring to a rape victim as the assailant's date.
Wearing bulletproof vests. This guy can't tell.
In their unguarded moments, IRS officials will admit that rather than providing a service, they are waging war on the public. This was made clear in the memoir Confessions of a Tax Collector by former IRS Revenue Officer Richard Yancey. According to Yancey, the language of war and the culture of conflict are the only means to prepare us for what is expected of us. How else could they, the commissars whom Yancey and his fellow cadres in the agency, demand what was expected of us? You can't take the life savings of income tax victims, their car, their paycheck, the roof over their head, and the heads of their children without dehumanizing them, without casting yourself in a role that by necessity makes them the enemy. One of Yancey's supervisors considered taxpayers to be at best fodder for the firing squad. That official, Yancey recalls, ended a profanity-strewn tirade by describing taxpayers unable to surrender every dime demanded by agents of federal extortion as deadbeats. If it were up to me, I'd line them up against a wall and shoot them. Yancey's supervisor obviously shared the late Joseph Stack's view that violence is the only answer, and if the agency is willing to use violence, it will certainly employ intimidation and fraud as well.
Now it's my pleasure to turn to Ms. Long, who I would point out is a current employee of the IRS, puts a future career at great risk, but I admire her courage and willingness to come here because of her dedication to the IRS. Ms. Long.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Senators, thank you for allowing me to come before you this afternoon to provide an accounting of activities within the Internal Revenue Service. As you know, my name is Jennifer Long.
In 1997 congressional testimony, Houston IRS agent Jennifer Long disclosed that the agency teaches its agents to use
tactics which appear nowhere in the IRS manual are used to extract unfairly assessed taxes from taxpayers, literally ruining families, lives, and businesses, all unnecessarily and sometimes illegally.
Like any bully or predator, the IRS will focus its attention on weak, helpless targets, and it will retaliate against such people if they dare to assert their rights.
The IRS will often pursue a taxpayer who is viewed to be vulnerable. To the IRS, vulnerabilities can be based on a perception that the taxpayer has limited formal education, has suffered a personal tragedy, is having a financial crisis, or may not necessarily have a solid grasp of their legal rights. Please understand, many agents are encouraged by management to pursue tax assessments that have no basis in tax law from individuals who simply can't fight back. However, if that taxpayer does object or complain, every effort will be made by the IRS to run up their tax assessment, deplete their financial resources, and force them to capitulate to IRS demands.
What are IRS employees taught when they attend their lavish company retreats and training sessions? A videotaped training lecture presented to IRS employees in the Arkansas-Oklahoma district illustrates that the agency deliberately cultivates sadism and cruelty as part of its official culture. In his lecture, the IRS trainer referring to the agency's victims told his audience to make them cry. We don't give points around here for being good scouts. The word is enforced. If that's not tattooed on your forehead or somewhere else, then you need to get it. Enforcement, seizure, and sales. That's our mindset. You're not out there to take any prisoners. Prisoners are like an installment agreement. They have to be fed and clothed and housed, all that stuff. They're expensive. We're not here to do that. If you've got an assessment, enforce collection until they come to their knees. In the American view, society is ruled by law rather than by men. The only legitimate role for government is the protection of life and property. By way of contrast, the totalitarian view of government, which was exhibited in such a memorable way in National Socialist Germany, holds that the ruling elite is not ruled by law. They are the law and can exercise power in any way they see fit. These contending views of government are mutually exclusive. Which of them is embraced by the IRS? In his memoir, former IRS agent Richard Yancey recalls a similar training session in which he and other future revenue agents were told by the instructor that the IRS had no use for those who anguished over each closure as if their decisions meant life or death for the taxpayer. One trainee who had not been fully indoctrinated objected that the decision to confiscate the tax victim's money and property very often is a matter of life and death. That prompted the supervisor to explain that the IRS's mission has nothing at all to do with doing the right thing for the taxpayer, but rather was that of protecting the government's interests. But what if the government's interest is wrong? Persisted the trainee. Our interest is never wrong or right, rejoined the supervisor in a reply worthy of his kindred spirits in the service of other totalitarian enforcement organs. It just is.
Despite the complete lack of any evidence linking the president to the targeting of Tea Party groups, Republicans are using it as their latest weapon in the war against the black man in the White House. We welcome the latest phrase in the lexicon of Republican attacks on this president, the IRS. 3 letters that sound so innocent, but we know what you mean.
The leader principle is another symptom of encroaching totalitarianism, and some of Barack Obama's most chauvinistic defenders are claiming either that the IRS acted appropriately in targeting the president's political critics, or that complaining about its abuses is merely a covert form of racism. This ignores the fact that Richard Nixon faced impeachment for using the IRS in precisely the same fashion that the Obama administration employed it, that is, as a cudgel to beat and intimidate the president's opponents. But the IRS targeting scandal is merely one manifestation of a far deadlier problem, namely the very existence of the income tax and the IRS itself. In his classic 1954 book, The Income Tax, Root of All Evil, the scholar Frank Chodorov observed that enactment of the 16th Amendment in 1913 transformed the government into one alien of the American tradition. America is no longer the America of the Declaration of Independence. From that time, the American government has actually asserted what it believes to be a superior claim on everything each of us earns, and then arbitrarily tells us how much we will be permitted to keep. Or as Shadorov summarizes the government's implicit message, your earnings are not exclusively your own. We have a claim on them, and our claim precedes yours. We will allow you to keep some of it, because we recognize your need, not your right. But whatever we grant you for yourself is for us to decide. In 2013, the world observes the 100th anniversary of the 16th Amendment, which imposed the income tax and the creation of the Federal Reserve System. The Fed, as it's known, is the world's most powerful central bank, a privately owned institution that acts as an official arm of the U.S. government. It prints currency to pay the debts and operating expenses of the government, and sells that currency to the government at a profit. And as the current Fed chairman Ben Bernanke points out, there is no theoretical limit to the amount of money the Fed can create out of nothing. This brings up an interesting question. If the Fed can simply print money, why does the government bother to collect taxes at all? The answer to that question, ironically, was provided by a Federal Reserve official named Beardsley Ruml. In the January 1946 issue of American Affairs magazine, Ruml, at the time chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, published an essay bearing the provocative title, "Taxes for Revenue Are Obsolete." During World War II, Ruml had helped implement the automatic payroll tax system, which has remained in place ever since. As a Fed official, he understood how monetary inflation works. As an architect of the withholding mechanism, he knew how the tax system operates. He was therefore uniquely qualified to explain why income taxes are collected. The introduction to Ruml's article offered a tidy summary of his views. His thesis is that, given control of a central banking system and an inconvertible currency, that is one not backed by gold, a sovereign national government is finally free of money worries and need no longer levy taxes for the purpose of providing itself with revenue. All taxation, therefore, should be regarded from the point of view of social and economic consequences. Boiled down to its essence, what Ruml was saying is that because the Fed exists, the U.S. government doesn't need to collect income taxes to fund its operations. Instead, it uses the tax code for the purpose of social engineering.
Don't have health insurance right now, or are on the individual market and are paying exorbitant amounts for coverage that isn't that great. And what we're doing is we're setting up a pool so that they can all pool together and get a better deal from insurance companies. And those who can't afford it, we're going to provide them with some subsidies. That's it. I mean, that's what's left.
This brings us to the crux of the matter regarding the IRS targeting of Tea Party activists. Namely, the central role of the IRS in enforcing the most radical social engineering scheme in American history, the Obamacare law. The so-called Affordable Care Act is a huge and metastasizing bureaucratic monstrosity. Even before it is fully implemented, it has become clear to both critics and supporters that the Obamacare Act will not actually make healthcare affordable or expand coverage to the uninsured. However, it did provide a huge expansion of the IRS's powers and its personnel base. Under Obamacare, the IRS will have access to the confidential financial and medical records of all Americans, and will determine who is eligible for healthcare subsidies and how these subsidies will be administered.
You're not going to believe this. Get this. Okay. The person, we've been telling you about the IRS scandal, right? And how they've been targeting conservatives, Tea Party, stuff like that. Turns out the woman in charge of those cracking down on the 501c3s and 4s, Sarah Hall Ingram.
This is a radical new mission for the IRS, one that will allow it quite literally to make life and death decisions that affect the lives of all Americans. Directing that mission is Sarah Hall Ingram, the former director of the Cincinnati IRS office that was directly involved in illegally targeting Tea Party groups. The Tea Party was not merely an annoyance to Barack Obama. By opposing Obamacare, the Tea Party movement became a threat to the long-term institutional interests of the IRS itself. That's why it was targeted by Douglas Shulman, Lois Lerner, and Sarah Hall Ingram. And through Obamacare, the IRS will have each of us in its crosshairs.
Now, Joe, what originally led you to seek a position with the IRS?
Well, I had
number of friends and family who were in law enforcement. In fact, some of my brothers are actually police officers. And I wanted to use my financial training and skills to serve in a law enforcement capacity myself. So I looked around for the best opportunities for someone with a financial background like myself, and I found the IRS Criminal Investigation Division was a place where I could actually utilize my skills. And I was really quite disappointed after 3 years into that career to learn just how many lies the IRS and the federal government were telling to the American public, and I refused to take part in it. I asked questions of my supervisors and wanted to get to the truth of the matter, and my supervisors at the IRS would not cooperate with me in any way. And even though they had taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution, just like I had, they were refusing to address these very important matters. So I had no other choice but then to resign from the IRS back in 1999. IRS, for decades, in their literature, in their internal manuals, has used the word voluntary very, very frequently. And the reason they do that is, of course, because the federal income tax, to a large segment of the population, has to be voluntary in order to maintain its constitutionality. But in day-to-day practice, the IRS pulls out a club and basically beats the American people with it. So looking at the IRS's conduct versus what they say in their literature would give an American pause if they would just take a look and compare. I used to be in the lunchroom with other special agents, criminal investigators of the IRS, and there was really a very flippant attitude towards the public. I don't recall anyone ever saying that they'd line them up and shoot them, but a very flippant, nasty attitude towards the public. And I think that's endemic in the IRS culture, because so much of what the IRS does is wrong, it's illegal, it's immoral. And I think that this has an effect on the agents. And so basically all that they can do is laugh and joke, make fun of the American people, of the taxpayers. And I was quite uncomfortable with that kind of an attitude. I'm sure I wouldn't be surprised if it got to the point where they would make ugly statements like that. It is quite common that you'll see joking and nasty statements towards the public. And I don't think it's necessary. And I think, again, it's endemic within the IRS because of what they do on a day-to-day basis. The way that when it comes to collection enforcement, they will get an assessment in an illegal manner, commit fraud in their computer systems, do whatever it takes to generate an IRS notice that tells the recipient that they owe tax. And then when it comes to the collection phase, the enforced collection phase, the agents will do whatever is necessary, tell banks whatever is necessary to get the money out of the bank account, lie to county recorders about the legitimacy of a lien or a tax debt. There's hardly any accountability on the average IRS agent to obey the law, and many of these agents don't even know what the law says. They just listen to their supervisor who tells them what to do.
So you're saying that the IRS actively lies to banks and other official entities in order to get money from the American people?
I'm afraid so. The agents will actually, there's this fervor inside the IRS. It grips the agents that they have to collect the tax money, and they believe what they're doing largely is right. But the problem is, as you've probably seen with federal, state, local law enforcement, sometimes in their vigor to enforce the law or get the bad guys, they'll break the law in doing that. And of course, I think that's very prevalent in the IRS among all the agencies. The fact of the matter is that, and again, this is something that drives me crazy that the American people don't pay closer attention to, and that is how many lawmakers, how many government officials, give their collective fingers to the American people and to the government about their own tax obligations, and the government officials are largely the biggest cheats there are. And when there's these confirmation hearings and other scrutiny, the truth comes out that they are about as hypocritical as one can get. And I fail to understand why the American people don't get more upset and do something about this double standard, where the American people are expected to dot every I and cross every T, but all these officials who are administering the system, even the Treasury Secretary himself, are not dotting I's and crossing T's, and they're actually cheating not only the system, but their fellow Americans. And I think, if I had any advice to give the average government employee, it would be, sure, your paycheck and your pension are important, but they're not near as important as doing your duty and obeying your oath.
Now, Joe, when you went to your superiors and you asked them about the law and the voluntary tax system, they asked you to resign, and you did so. Was there any retribution after you spoke out publicly?
Not initially. I resigned in 1999, but eventually the full force of the IRS and their big brother, the Department of Justice, came at me with everything they had, including criminal prosecutions, civil fines and penalties. They're really doing everything they can to try to silence me. They haven't been successful so far, as you can see, as I'm accepted the invitation to appear on your show. But they do have a lot of power that they wield, and I discourage people from taking on the IRS one-on-one, but there's a great deal of research and investigation and fact-finding that every American can do without necessarily taking any action, but gather your facts, educate yourself first, and then you'll have a better idea about how to proceed. And I do find that people who find out about all these frauds in the medical establishment or in the tax establishment, they want to take them all on at once. And I find that that's really a poor strategy, just from personal experience and realizing that I needed to choose my battles, but even my colleagues and other people that I've encountered out in America. So take your time, do your educating of yourself. It will take time to do that. And don't take any action until you've really thought it out and looked at the landscape, to see what dangers might befall you.
I have not done anything wrong. I have not broken any laws. I have not violated any IRS rules or regulations, and I have not provided false information to this or any other congressional committee.
She said she'd resolved this situation. She said she had stopped the targeting of conservative groups. A year later, she demands a group fulfill a request for the inappropriate information.
That this administration has a penchant for seeking vengeance against those who want to speak out against it.
The IRS, in effect, put all these groups in a box by delaying their exemptions, by auditing others, and even auditing individuals personally.
But if you really want to test a man, give him power.
Is there anything that this administration will be actually held accountable for?
The IRS uses fear and violence to force people to submit to its will, not because it's collecting revenue to fund vital government operations, but rather as part of a program of social engineering. Within just a few years, this agency that rules through terror will be in charge not only of our wealth, but our health as well. That's when we will no longer have to choose between death and taxes, because both of those matters will be in the hands of the IRS. That is, they will be, unless Americans finally decide to be rid of this instrument of state terrorism once and for all.